Here's a Roman helmet, really a Celtic design. The Romans were sort of like a cultural sponge, always eager to absorb, assimilate, and later modify anything they see elsewhere that works. Interestingly, here's a helmet with a very similar shape from the opposite side of the world 2,000 years later. That's one of those designs that have endured pretty well in history. I wish I could show the dimensions well, but that right there is tiny. It's hard to convey that, but the blade is extremely narrow. It looks like a child's toy almost. This is another one of those cases where you can get a very wrong impression of the size just from seeing photo or even video. I mean, even if I hold my hand here, you can't quite get a feel for it because, of course, my hand is in the foreground, but maybe if I move it a little bit, you can sort of get an idea. This spearhead is really small. Remarkably small. It's an extremely narrow blade, and it's hard to really convey that. There's also the opposite, unusually large spearheads. You can get an idea of the dimensions by comparing to the helmets. There's the copper dagger from Cyprus, about 4,000 years old, and you can see that they reshaped it to make the best of the material. They gave it this really defined, strong central ridge there to make sure that it's more durable. That thick ridge there in the center would give it much more strength while keeping the weight reasonably low. Not that it matters as much for a dagger, but still, you can definitely tell that they knew what they were doing. Good old Corinthian helmet. This is one of my favorite types. It's really not one of the best designs in history, and they kept modifying them. For example, creating openings for the ears so you can actually hear commands and other important sounds on the battlefield. The more interesting looking ones have smaller eye openings, but of course that's not really great for vision. So you can see this is an earlier one. Later ones are improved, but they don't necessarily look as good. Another example of misleading proportions. If you see this sword, you may think it's much larger than it is. And I really can't show it because my hand is too far in the foreground. There's no way at all to show it other than if you look at the pin. Yeah, the pin, it kind of serves to show the dimensions. But that javelin head in particular is extremely narrow. So the length is... It's probably about from my fingertips to the center of my forearm, maybe? I think the thickness of that javelin head is closer to my pinky than anything else, so the socket is tiny. Double axes, you remember the video I made about those? They definitely look usable. Whether they were is another question. I feel like this one, unless that's later damage, looks like that could be from use, but it's always hard to say whether that happened at the time or later. This one is pretty small. Right, that's a reproduction, so I can't actually touch that, so yeah, you can see. It's pretty small. It's quite a nice bronze dagger there with alabaster handle. And there's a khopesh. That's nice, you can actually see the handle scales on that one. They're preserved. It's quite rare. There is the Renaissance armor. Generally, if you ask me which is my favorite style of armor, I would always have to come back to that. There's better looking examples, you know, these helmets in particular, and I don't like as much, but I just have to respect just how advanced armor was at that point. You could say that a suit of Gothic plate looks better, you know, depending on your taste, but I think it's very hard to beat this. You know, just the way they were fitted and how many overlapping plates they have. Depends on which individual suit, of course. There was plenty of variation. But just the craftsmanship is quite impressive on these. And there we have the superior sword. You know, all jokes aside, it may not be the most impressive sword, but it's intricate. You know, maybe not as complex as a rapier, like that. I also want to show the blades from the side so you get an idea of the cross-section, but it's pretty difficult. That's a nice pollaxe. I mean, which one isn't, right? And you can see how the haft is shaped. Basically octagonal. And they made the langets flush. Mostly. Got a little sloppy at the bottom there, but generally they're inset to be flush. Of course, the farther back in time you go, the less well preserved they tend to be. Those spearheads are heavily corroded. That's pretty well preserved considering the time. And I wish I could show you the size a little bit better, but I can't get close enough to really give you an idea. But I'm not sure my hand would even really fit on there. I think just about. I could probably just about cram it in there, which is probably the idea. I'm assuming they were generally made for the hand size of the wearer so that it fits just about perfectly. This one here offers a bit more space. And that is quite a bit larger. So my hand would comfortably fit there. It's a little bit difficult to show side by side. I'm going to have to take a picture to show both, ideally straight on. This is a substantially larger sword than that, between 900 and 1025. That's more the kind of size you would expect for a sword of war. They call it a great sword. Basically, it's great sword of war is what they're often called. You could also just call it a longsword. So you can see right there, this one doesn't even have a point. At that time, it was all about cutting, because the primary protection was mail, so the blunt impact even through the mail would be substantial. And then as armor developed, they started to make the blades pointier. And just tapered them. You can see here already, this is already a little bit more tapered. And then we get all the way over here, mid to late 14th century, and then of course in the 15th century they fully committed. Well, there is what looks like battle damage. You can see that notch there. There are several notches in fact, but this one is very obvious. There's one notch in particular that's extremely obvious, where you can see the angle at which a blade cut into it. So that, I would say, is pretty much definitely battle damage. I can't really see how that would happen otherwise. So I'm pretty sure this sword was used. It was great to see a well-preserved blade with such distinctive edge damage. Usually the condition makes it pretty difficult to tell what happened at the time and what happened later due to corrosion or excavation. The blade at the bottom here is also particularly interesting. I have a strong suspicion that where the edge dips in, that's a repair. It would seem unusual to me to intentionally shape it that way to begin with. And it's also right where I would suspect the sweet spot of the blade to be, the center of percussion, where it actually hits on impact. There might have been some nicks and gouges there that were repaired by grinding them out. There's quite a nice cut spot there. Get a look at the hilt here. I like how the quillon is actually connected to the other one. Both of them are connected to each other. That's a little different than what you usually see. It's quite thin, as it should be. You have a thicker ricasso there under the guard, or above the guard, however you want to look at it. And then the blade itself is quite thin, and it does have a distal taper. And there we have a bishop's mantle. I'll try to get a close-up picture of the weave. These look ceremonial to me. They are quite large, and especially with the way the guard is shaped on the one in the back. That one is most definitely ceremonial. The other two, I would guess probably too. And weight-wise, the one in the front would be usable. 2.8 kilograms, 6.2 pounds. The one in the middle, 4.7 kilograms, 10.2 pounds. The rear, 4.3 kilograms and 9.4 pounds. Yeah, those two seem a little too clunky. There's a nice basket-hilt sword. Black and white armor. That's the style that I particularly like. It doesn't show as much on this. There's some that have much richer contrast, you know, deeper black and, of course, highly polished steel parts. There's a Dosak right there, or Sinclair hilt saber. That looks pretty familiar. (1796) English infantry officer sword. That's the one that people often point to as the worst sword in history. And yeah, there were complaints about it for sure. But I feel like you can easily find worse swords if you go farther back in history. Overall, if you haven't been to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto yet, it's easily one of the best museums in Canada, if not the best, of the ones I've been to. Check out the link to the ROM in the video description below. This is not sponsored in any way, but I would highly recommend giving it a visit. Hope you found this interesting, and thanks for watching, folks.